welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hello and welcome to the Language Fuel podcast, episode number 15. Today we're having a look at some very simple tips at how to manage classroom behaviour. So a teacher in the Language Fuel community got in touch with me and mentioned an issue she was having with the behaviour of her students in her language classroom. Now, while at least half of the students were definitely paying attention and participating, there were a handful of students, and one in particular, who were not participating. And for example, when she passed out a worksheet for the students to fill out, this particular student just sat there and didn't even pick up his pen. So that is extremely frustrating, and she got in touch, and said, are there a few tips or tricks you could give? So I've decided to provide those for her and for you as well. First of all, my stance would be to say that it's always good to view behaviour as symptomatic rather than as the cause of a problem. In other words, a student will behave in a certain way because of some underlying need that's not being met or a problem that he or she has. So it's far better to solve the problem, figure out what it is and solve the problem, than to try to adjust a behaviour. At best, if you are asking for behaviour change or forcing behaviour change, you might produce the desired result, at least temporarily, but you might also potentially create resentment in the student. And at worst, the student will feel unfairly judged and alienated, and the relationship between student and teacher can become damaged if you just go straight for the behaviour. So the first thing you need to do is diagnose what the issue is. Now, I'm suggesting there's probably 3 categories of issues that you need to be on the lookout for. I'm sure there could be other reasons why people might display unwanted behaviour, but these are 3 big ones that are quite common and that you can address. The first one is unclear expectations. Now, this is common particularly when you're teaching a language in the target language, because obviously, it could be that the learner doesn't understand the instructions that have been given if they're given in the target language instead of the student's native language. So very, very easy issue to happen in those types of situations. So you need to ask yourself, does my student actually know what is expected of him or her? Have I made it clear to all of the students? It's a good idea whenever giving instructions to concept check those instructions. So ask very simple questions to check whether or not the students have got your instructions. So if you say, we're going to be reading for 5 minutes. The question is, how long will we read? And you want, 5 minutes to be the answer or something like that. Or we're going to break into groups of 3 and complete this task. How many friends do you need to find? 2. So you're expecting a very quick and simple answer. The whole class can quickly yell it out. And if there were 1 or 2 people who missed it or didn't quite understand that instruction, when their classmates say the answer to your question, right, they've got it. So there's no need for them to feel embarrassed that they didn't understand the question. They'll just figure that out. So concept checking very quickly is good. And I would also suggest it's great to explicitly lay down ground rules in a classroom when you first have a new cohort of students. And the ground rules might be written in a poster format or a handout that you pass or a little card with sort of a credit card size that the students could keep in their wallets. And the ground rules, they don't need to be long-winded explanations, especially if it is an immersion type classroom. It could even be pictures or diagrams explaining rules of behaviour. So when the teacher is talking, we listen. When my classmates are talking, I'm listening, and things like that. Just really simple ground rules so that before any issues come up, you could always go back and point the students to those ground rules to start with. So making sure that your expectations are clear in the first place is a great way to start. And I think a lot of teachers forget this very, very simple way to get the behaviour that they are desiring. And all teachers definitely have the power to influence this part of their teaching. The second typical cause of unwanted behavior is that the material that's being taught is at some level inappropriate. Now, that could be the actual difficulty level of the material. So, if the material is too easy, you'll get students sitting there who are bored out of their tree. They're not learning anything. They feel like it's a waste of their time. So they don't want to bother because they already know it. They've done it before. So that is a very simple thing to recognize by simple conversations with the student, and perhaps there's a way that you could make the material a little bit more complex or challenging for that student. On the other hand, obviously, if you've got material that's too difficult for students in your class, they're not going to know where to start. It's going to be overwhelming for them, and they're going to sit there going, I have no idea how to even begin to do this exercise because it's well beyond my current capabilities. So that's quite a difficult thing for students to deal with. And then I guess another thing to think about, rather than the actual level or the challenging aspect of the material, is it appropriate for the age level? If you're teaching students who are perhaps children and you're giving them things to talk about or to read about that they just don't understand yet, then that's not going to get anywhere. And same the other way around. If you're teaching perhaps teenagers and giving them children's material where it talks about playing with a ball and kicking it around or visiting the zoo, they might feel a little bit insulted, going, really? You want me to read a story about going to the zoo and I'm sort of 16? I want to talk about social media and boyfriends and girlfriends and maybe traveling or sports or something like that. So again, that can be boring or perhaps overwhelming. Now, I'm quite conscious that not all teachers have the ability to change the material that they're presenting in their classroom, especially if the curriculum has been prescribed, for example, by their own institution or by an exam board that they're teaching if they're preparing students for a particular exam. However, there are a couple of workarounds. So first of all, it's best to simply acknowledge the issue, figure it out and acknowledge it with the student. Hey, Johnny, I realize that, this is perhaps a little bit easy for you because you've got fantastic skills in this area. So even just the acknowledgement will help the student warm up again to you, knowing that you understand them a little bit better. And then obviously you have the opportunity to supplement whatever materials you need to use with the classroom. So with one student, you might provide an extra worksheet to give a bit more challenge to avoid the boredom issue. For another student, you might find an easier version of something, or just perhaps 2 questions instead of 7, for them to just slowly work their way through. So supplementing material is great. And of course, you can do this either individually or in groups. You may find that in a classroom of 20 students, you've got 5 of them who are needing a bit of challenge, and on the other hand, you've got 5 who need a little bit of help. Plan in some time for groups to get together and do a slightly different exercise while the majority or the mainstream are working on the material that you had originally planned. So that's some ways that you can overcome material which may not be appropriate for everybody. And the final thing to think about when you're trying to figure out causes of unwanted classroom behavior is the social dynamics in the classroom. So there's a couple of things here. First of all, it could be that a student is feeling unsafe in a social situation. So they might be shy. Most people are shy day one. They don't know anybody else in the classroom necessarily. And will the other students accept them? Will they laugh at them? Who's going to be sort of the fun person? Who's the classroom clown? Who's the classroom know-it-all? They've got to figure out all these things at the beginning of a new classroom. So it's the teacher's responsibility to work with the group as a whole to establish positive dynamics. And there's a few ways you can do that. Obviously, there's introductions. The teacher can introduce students, students can introduce themselves. There's hundreds of icebreaking games. If you don't know any good ones, just Google icebreaking games for the language classroom or something like that. Allow for equal turn sharing and turn taking, equal times at talking. When you're in a group situation, you can use a physical object such as a ball where you pass the ball to the next person and only the person who has the ball is allowed to speak, whether they're introducing themselves or providing an answer for the activity, and when they're done, they pass the ball to the next person. Those types of activities that very clearly show the rules for interacting within the group, provide a very safe place for a person to be. They don't need to figure out, when is it going to be my turn? Am I supposed to interrupt here? How much pausing do I need before it's my turn to speak? And all of that. Take that away if you can. Games are fantastic to play where, again, rules are very clear. I roll the dice and this is what I'm allowed to do when it's my turn. I pass the turn to the other person. These are how I get points. It just allows for no guesswork. Everybody knows what the rules of interaction are, and it puts people on the same playing field. I also recommend mixing groups up a lot. Put people in small groups of 3. When they've had a go and they've figured out and learned who that person is, mix them up again. Give them a different group of 3, and they can do the same activity but with a different group, and they'll get more confidence because they've had a little practice with the previous group. And there's only a couple of people that I need to sort of perform in front of. My 2 classmates right here are going to hear me say these sentences in the language. So mixing up lots of small groups and repeating the same exercise is another good way for students to build confidence with their classmates. And obviously you should never allow anyone to be laughed at, and certainly never allow anyone to laugh at other people. Nip it in the bud immediately. We don't laugh at other people in this classroom. Now, whether you do that privately or publicly probably depends on the context. As we mentioned earlier, certainly publicly there needs to be ground rules set at the beginning before it's ever an issue. And then if it does happen once or maybe twice, you can remind that person, remember that rule over there, we don't laugh at our classmates. So never allow anyone to be laughed at. That's certainly a golden rule of teaching. So that's in terms of somebody feeling shy or not feeling confident. But there is, I guess, another type of social dynamic that is a little bit more difficult to deal with, and that is when there are pre-existing social relationships with students in the class that the teacher is not aware of. Now, they could be positive relationships, and sometimes they are very pleasant surprises because those students enjoy working with one another. They already feel confident, so they can work in other groups and spread their confidence and so on. But there can be pre-existing negative relationships between students that, again, you're not going to have a clue about until something rears its head and you realize that these students have issues with one another. I remember when I was just starting out as a language teacher and I was teaching an English class here in New Zealand for migrants. And this particular class was full of elderly folks, all with the same country of origin. And they were all retired. They had come to live with their children who were the working age and be with their grandchildren. So it was a group of probably 15 elderly folk, all who had the same first language, and they wanted to learn English so that they could participate a little bit in New Zealand society. And it was a very low level class, sort of perhaps strong beginners or low elementary level. And I had no idea about social dynamics at that stage. As I say, it was probably my first year teaching. I thought it was a nice, gentle class to get my teeth stuck into, learn how to teach in a nice, safe environment. These are all wonderfully calm people as far as I could tell. And they enjoyed coming to class every day, and we had fun. We played some games, and the material was quite simple because the language was quite simple at that stage. Unbeknownst to me, there had been some pre-existing relationships in the classroom, and in particular between one man and one woman who were sort of enemies of some sort. And I never quite figured out how it happened or what the long back history was, and it probably didn't matter. But the point was, at one point in the classroom, this thing reared its head. We were having an hour where we were not allowed to speak the first language. It was going to be English only, and that's quite difficult when your English ability is low. So we had a little jar in the classroom where if you spoke your mother tongue, you had to put 10 cents in the jar. And at the end of the week, we were going to, buy some muffins or whatever with whatever money we ended up getting. And we'd done it before. We managed to buy 3 or 4 muffins, which we cut up and shared between the class. So the activity wasn't new. Everybody knew the rules. But what happened was one of these 2, I guess, feuding students spoke their native language inadvertently, and everyone said, oh, 10 cents, 10 cents, and they knew the rules. And this other person started laughing and actually mocking the student for having made this error. Now, at the time, everyone sort of laughed a little bit. As long as people are laughing with the student, it doesn't really matter. But what I hadn't really picked up was that this person was laughing at the other person, and it was a deep wound because of the existing relationship, and it very quickly escalated. So I found myself as a young, I think 19-year-old, with these two elderly folk, retired folk, standing up and suddenly screaming at one another, very negative in their own language. And I had no idea what to do. Rather than, saying, excuse me, you need to stop, you need to calm down, or whatever it is, which is what I would do now immediately, I sort of stood there and I froze, and I had no idea. I was just shocked that this behavior could come from these wonderful elderly people. So as I guess I had nothing else to do, I just walked out of the classroom and walked to my colleague next door, and I said, can you come and help me? I've got a fight breaking out. And he laughed because he thought, what? You've got the old folks next door. And I said, yes, I have, and they're fighting. So by the time we'd walked back in the classroom, some of the other students had intervened and pulled the other students away from one another, and they eventually went down and talked to the director of studies, and who actually spoke their language, which was fantastic. So she was able to, I guess, give a little bit of counselling between the two of them, and they both came back to class, and we continued on, after that, the next day, and kind of pretended like nothing had ever happened. I think these days I would certainly talk with the students and ask if there's anything else I could help with, and maybe come up with some strategy about seating arrangements to perhaps avoid them having to work together or something like that. But anyway, I'll never forget it. It taught me such a lesson that you just never know what's going on for your students. And again, treat the behavior that you're seeing as symptomatic of underlying causes, because there are so many things that can be going on for somebody that you as the teacher simply don't know about. So to assume that the behavior is all about you, they just don't like me as a teacher, and they're just being ornery, and they just don't want to work because whatever, they're trying to push the boundaries with me. It's probably not about you, actually. There's probably a whole bunch of other stuff going on. So I guess my tips are, I think, at least along the lines of these three areas. First of all, are the expectations clear, and what can you as a teacher do to make the expectations clear? Secondly, is the material appropriate, and is there anything you can do as a teacher to provide more appropriate material? And thirdly, think about the social dynamics with the rest of the students. Is there anything you can do to smooth the relationships, and are there perhaps any other pre-existing relationships that you need to be aware of and manage that constructively through the rest of your class? So good luck. I'm conscious that as I'm publishing this now, mid-January 2017, there's a lot of teachers here in New Zealand about to get back into the classroom. So have a great time getting to know your new students. Make sure you set down some great ground rules, break the ice with them really well, have fun, get lots of healthy, positive laughter going, and that'll set you up really well for the year. And if there's any questions you have, any topics you'd like me to discuss on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. You can feel free to send me an email at podcast@languagefuel.com, and I'll do my best to answer your question. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do go ahead and leave us a review or a rating at iTunes so that other people can find it as well. I look forward to hearing from you, and until next time, ka kite anō. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.